Did Noah's Ark really happen as Genesis describes? Could floodwaters really have covered the entire globe? Was God so angry with humans that he destroyed almost every living creature on Earth? If the flood did happen as Genesis describes, what does that reveal about our lives and purpose on Earth? And could it happen again?
Hi, I'm Marcus Lloyd, and this is Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. Now, in this series, we have been exploring the first book of the Bible and seeing that there's more information and more truth in it than we could have ever imagined. Now, you can't get very far into the book of Genesis without running into the story of Noah's Ark. For many of us, this was the first Bible story that we read as a child. And that's probably why so many Christians view it as more of a fable than a real-life event. But the scientific evidence suggests that it is a very real event that permanently changed the geology and climate of planet Earth. Now, if you've ever been on a sailboat on a lake like this, you know you need to check the weather, take certain precautions. Any slight change in the wind can produce very drastic and dangerous consequences. I wonder what it was like back in Noah's day, preparing for a flood no one else believed was coming. Now, you know the Bible story. In Genesis 6, God told Noah to build an ark that would keep his family alive along with 2 of every kind of bird, animal, and creeping thing of the earth. And God gave Noah very specific instructions for its design. The ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, with lower, second, and third decks, and a window and a door in the side. Estimating a cubit at 18 inches, the average distance between a man's elbow and his fingertips, this measures out to be about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Noah built the ark according to God's instructions, and it was sturdy enough to withstand the battering wind and waves of a year-long worldwide flood. But biblical scholars aren't the only ones who believe that there was a worldwide flood. Stories of a great flood that wipe out everyone but a small group of people can be found in ancient texts and folklore and cultures all over the world. Local geography and cultural aspects may be different, but these legends tell of a similar flood story. Scientists, both secular and creationist, also agree that there was major catastrophic flooding in Earth's past. However, that's where their agreements end. See, scientists have 2 very different opinions of this account based on 2 different presuppositions. To better understand these points of view, we need to get our head around these 2 very large words that are key to our discussion: uniformitarianism and catastrophism. These are 2 different foundational beliefs that explain why 2 scientists who look at the same evidence can come back with 2 different conclusions. To explore this mystery, let's take a trip to one of the great natural wonders of the world. So we've come to the Grand Canyon to see ancient evidence of the destructive power of water. But let's look at that word uniformitarianism again. It explains the idea that the processes of erosion and deposition that exist today have always existed and always function the same way and at the same rate everywhere on Earth. An easier way to say this is that the present is a key to the past. This concept underlies the belief that our world is billions of years old. Secular scientists believe that a single layer of geological strata represents a significant amount of time, even millions of years of Earth's activity. These secular scientists acknowledge that the landscape has changed over these millions of years, but maintain that the change has been slow and gradual and happened at a fairly constant rate. Does that sound familiar? That's because if you apply the uniformitarian point of view to biology, you get the theory of evolution. So, what would a uniformitarian have to say about Noah's flood? They'd say it never happened.
Uniformitarianism is the belief or philosophy or doctrine, if you will, that you can explain Earth history without resorting to things that are out of the ordinary, geologically speaking. It's the assumption that today's geological processes operating at the rates and intensities we see today are all you need to explain things like the rocks and the fossils and the strata. It's summed up in the motto that the present is the key to the past.
According to the uniformitarian view, the Grand Canyon was gradually carved by the Colorado River beginning about 17 million years ago. But what if the present isn't the key to the past? Creation scientists see the world in the opposite way. They see the past as being very different than what we see now, and don't assume that all the processes happened the same way and at the same rate as they do today. That's because between what we see now and what we would have seen then, there's been a world-altering catastrophe that's resulted in the geological formations that you see here. This doctrine of catastrophism says that the geological features of our planet, like the ones in this canyon, are the consequences of a key catastrophic event, a violent, destructive flood and its after effects. Creation scientists say that the forces that shaped this landscape and altered the climate and geology of our planet were all caused in a very short time and by a single catastrophic event. The element that played a key role in this catastrophe is the one that's essential for our survival: water. When we think about a flood, we tend to think about a heavy rain that causes a river to rise above its banks and flood streets and homes. We don't always think about the extremely destructive power of water, like when a dam breaks and a raging torrent of water crashes down. So, we're back in the lab to conduct a little simulation of what happened back in the Grand Canyon. This is a model of Earth's geological strata. Yeah, I know it doesn't compare to the Grand Canyon, but just stay with me here. Now, we add a little water, and we get a puddle. No big deal. We add a little bit more water and pressure, then we get some disruption. But if we add more water and more speed to that water, then we start tearing up the Earth, changing things. We are, in fact, creating a catastrophe. So that's the power of water. It makes things wet, but it can also destroy them in its wake. Could the waters of Noah's flood have been so forceful that canyons were quickly carved out of the earth like the sand in this fish tank? How destructive was it?
The canyon itself was cut just after the flood as a large lake to the east in the Four Corners area, covering much of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, spilled over its western bank and rapidly carved a canyon more than a mile deep through the layered sediments. And this unfolded in a matter of a few days' time.
Based on this and other evidence, creation scientists believe that the Grand Canyon was not the result of gradual erosion, but the result of the catastrophe of Noah's flood. So we saw how much damage water can do. But the question remains, could floodwaters have really risen high enough to cover all 29,000 plus feet of Mount Everest? Well, secular and creation scientists agree that the floodwaters didn't rise high enough to cover the mountains. The mountains were smaller and more level, and were uplifted by the collision of continental plates to the heights that they are now. Sedimentary layers containing marine creatures were also uplifted to the higher elevations. That's how come we can find fossils of sea creatures atop the mountains of the Himalayas. But how and when did this uplift happen? And for that matter, where did all the sedimentary layers and water come from? Well, it turns out that both of those questions can be answered the same way. We expect that water came from the usual place, the sky. It rained for 40 days, all day long, all night long, pounding, hurricane-like torrential rain. But the picture's different now. You see, in fact, most of the water didn't come from above. It came from someplace else.
The Bible says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up or cleaved apart at the very beginning of the flood. The great deep, the Hebrew is Tehom, refers to the deep ocean. Many of us believe that processes that unfolded on the ocean bottom during the flood were responsible for much of the water that flooded the continents. These processes primarily involved rapid seafloor spreading, replacing cold, old ocean floor with hot ocean floor that occupied more volume. And that increased volume of the ocean floor displaced water that had been in the deep ocean up onto the continents. It caused the world sea level to rise. So we believe that that was a major source, if not the major source of the water that flooded over the continents. So what about the 4,000 feet of horizontally layered sediments that we see behind us? When did they form? Because they contain fossils, the logical implication is they are a product of the flood. So this implies that the flood was a much bigger event involving much more destruction than most people have understood.
Remember how the creation scientists believe that the Earth was very different before the flood? Well, both creation scientists and secular scientists generally agree that the continents were all a part of a large supercontinent, and that at some point, and for some reason, this huge continent broke up into continents that are shaped and located where we find them today.
The evidence is compelling that today's continents in an earlier time in Earth history were joined together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle into a massive supercontinent. We're convinced from the fossil evidence that a supercontinent existed at the beginning of the flood and also briefly during the middle of the flood. What this implies is that there was a tremendous amount of plate motion during the flood itself. For example, North and South America are roughly 3,000 miles away from Europe and Africa. During the flood, at least 3,000 miles of seafloor spreading took place just in the Atlantic part of the world.
Now, was this a slow and gradual process, as the uniformitarian point of view might say? Or was this a result of a catastrophe?
The plate velocities were much higher than they are today. Instead of 1 or 2 inches per year, during the flood, the plate velocities were on the order of 5 or so miles per hour.
And where did all that water go?
As the plate velocities at the end of the flood decreased, the oceans deepened, and the water that had been flooding the continents simply ran back into the ocean basins.
You see now why these two worldviews are so different. One says slow and gradual, and the other says fast and cataclysmic. In many ways, we explore Noah's flood because the cataclysmic flood answers so many questions about why our planet is how it is today. You see, you have to add billions of years and leave a lot of questions unanswered to explain our history without a flood. But when you include a flood into the equation, all of a sudden, many questions are answered and things just fall into place. The flood also explains something that has eluded scientists for centuries. What caused the Ice Age? You see, scientists agree that at least one ice age happened. And as it turns out, a worldwide flood creates the perfect conditions for an ice age, such as a change in the Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Since this is such an important topic, we're going to study the Ice Age in another episode. Now, depending on your point of view, you believe that these processes either happened thousands of years ago or millions of years ago. But there's one modern-day catastrophe that will take all of this talk about a worldwide flood from theory to reality.
Mount St. Helens, which is a volcano in Washington State, erupted in May of 1980. Many people remember that eruption because it was very well publicized and covered by the press. And Mount St. Helens is very exciting for creation scientists because it demonstrates that much geological work can be done in a very short amount of time. Not just the initial eruption itself in May of 1980, but there were subsequent eruptions later on and subsequent geological activity that occurred later. For one thing, about 2 years after that initial eruption, there was some mud flows that actually carved out a canyon that is essentially a 1/40th scale model of the Grand Canyon, and it happened in a single day. And people may have heard of the petrified forest at Yellowstone National Park. And the conventional thinking is that those trees are forests that grew there in place. They were covered by ash, volcanic ash. They became petrified. Over time, another forest grew up in place. It was covered in ash. It got petrified, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the number of layers that you have at Yellowstone National Park, you're looking at a time scale of maybe 40,000 years. And obviously that does not fit the Bible's relatively short time scale of about 6,000 years. So the reason Mount St. Helens is so exciting is that as a result of that eruption, you ended up with millions of logs that were floating in Spirit Lake. And if you remember the eruption, you probably remember seeing aerial footage of just millions of logs that were just floating in these log mats on the lake. And what happened is that these logs became waterlogged, and they began to rotate upright, and they would sink down into the lake. And so you ended up with all these tree stumps that are vertical in the sediment, very similar to what we see at Yellowstone National Park. So we think we now see at Mount St. Helens how that petrified forest was actually formed. So you have basically arguments for an old Earth, that Mount St. Helens has really done a lot to topple. So this is a strong exhibit for the fact that lots of geological work can be done in a very short time.
Now we've looked at the bare bones of the Chronicle of Noah as recorded in the book of Genesis. And as we talked about Noah and the mechanics of the flood, what we were actually talking more about is how we look at our world. Uniformitarianism or catastrophism. Local, small, gradual changes, or a worldwide, all-at-once catastrophe. And we may not all be scientists, but we all have to choose which way we're going to look at this. Now, the Bible actually talks about this issue. A couple thousand years after Noah lived, the Apostle Peter, writing about the return of Jesus, said that the scoffers would say, "All things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." Now, doesn't that sound like uniformitarianism? But Peter then explained, "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water." The word flooded in the original Greek is katakludzo, from which we derive the English word cataclysm. This verb is used only once in all the New Testament and describes the magnitude of the Genesis flood, a cataclysmic event like no other. The flood was an event so profound, it's been remembered in folklore and religious texts in cultures around the world. The Bible points out that people willfully forget that the flood ever happened. And that's what people are thinking today, saying that the flood didn't exist. Choosing to be willfully ignorant of the very compelling evidence that Noah's flood was real. So in looking at the Bible and what it has to say about the flood, it says a lot. Dimensions of the ark, geological details and such, but mostly it says that we should take the worldwide flood very seriously, knowing that it really happened. You know what I love about Genesis? That since it's the first book in the Bible, it sets up many themes that will later be played out in the rest of the scriptures. Now, it may not be apparent at first glance, but Noah's story sets up a theme and a pattern of Jesus spiritually rescuing us. Now, the Bible tells us that we're a lot like Noah. I mean, he spent decades building an ark. And every day he came outside and he looked at the sky and he saw the bright sunshine. Now, he could have easily stopped building, just assuming that the sunshine would always continue. But Noah knew that there was a tsunami on its way. Likewise, the Bible tells us that we are separated from God because of the wrongs that we've done. Now, nobody likes to talk about that. But then again, the Bible tells us that nobody wanted to talk about the coming flood either. In both Noah's story and our story, God provides a way of escape and rescue. The plan for Noah was a boat, but the plan for us was Jesus, a dying, rising Savior who paid the cost for all of our wrongdoing. But here's the point for us. Peter tells us that Noah preached the whole time that he was building the ark. He told everyone he knew about the flood that was coming. Anyone could have joined him on the boat, but it was only his family that believed him. You know, it takes courage to go against popular opinion and stand up for your faith like Noah did. The scientific evidence that creation scientists are uncovering indicate that many of the events described in Genesis are more than just a great adventure story. We'll see in other episodes the profound effect that Noah's flood had on the Earth's climate, on geology, and on human civilization. Much of the evidence for an ancient Earth is based on calculations that assume Earth's processes never change. But we've just seen compelling evidence that sometimes they do change. In the next episode, we'll explore the age of the Earth and investigate evidence that throws the entire timeline of Earth's physical history into doubt. So why does it even matter whether the Earth is billions of years old or just a few thousand? Keep watching as we unlock these and other mysteries of the book of Genesis. Have you ever asked yourself, what was here before? What was Earth like before I existed? What people, what animals have moved through the same space I'm in now? How long has everything been here? Just how old is this place we call home? Hi, I'm Marcus Lloyd, and welcome to Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. In this series, we've been looking at the first book of the Bible and finding there's more truth in it than we may have thought. Today, we're going to explore what Genesis says about the age of Earth and see how it stacks up to the scientific evidence. When we ask, how old is Earth? We're really asking a history question. What is our planet's history? How long has it been here? How was it formed? Unfortunately, no human being was around to see it happen. The best we can do is look at clues and test them with modern science and technology and draw conclusions based on the results. All scientists work with the same data or evidence, the same chemical, biological, and physical clues. They find information in fossils embedded in geologic formations like this trilobite embedded in shale. They also examine current processes that impact our Earth, like sedimentation, erosion, and plate movements. For example, the scientists know that many parts of the continents are covered by geologic strata, layers of rock stacked one on top of another, like these books, building up over time. They also learn from studying natural processes, such as the rate of decay in organic substances like plants and animals. And they can learn by studying the written records of ancient civilizations. These clues are available for all of us. The key is how we interpret the information we get from them. So, how old is the Earth? Let's look at the data and see how both secular and creation scientists interpret them. But instead of talking about it, how about a little field trip? a trip back in time. Our journey takes us all the way back to the beginning, to the creation. But how far back was that? How long will it take us to get there? I'll tell you what, I'm definitely packing a lunch. The age of Earth is a fundamental question. And to find the answers, we turn to both science and the Bible. In both cases, faith comes into play. Let's take a look at some of the methods that scientists use to estimate Earth's age. Age is not something that's always determined exactly. For instance, without your birth certificate or the testimony of your parents, how do you even know your own age, let alone someone else's? All scientists start with certain assumptions about the past, and then use faith in those assumptions, together with geology, physics, and chemistry, to make certain calculations about the planet's age, or more specifically, Earth's rocks. This is called geochronology. Now, there are several different ways to do this, and we sometimes get different results. The clocks that scientists use to estimate the age of rocks have things in common. They all assume, by faith, a constant process rate, like the sand in this hourglass. We assume that will always fall at a constant rate. And next, you need to have what's called a closed process system, like this glass. Nothing getting in there to interfere with the measurements. And finally, scientists have to begin with a known process component. Again, like the sand. You know how much you start with, so you know how much time passes as it falls. Did you get all that? A constant process rate, a closed process system, and a known initial process component. Simply speaking, if you know how much sand you have, and you know how fast it falls, and you know that it always falls at a constant rate, then you can calculate the time. But we'll talk more about that later. Well, now it's time to get going. Are you ready for an adventure? Let's explore the Grand Canyon for clues about the age of the Earth. We come to the Grand Canyon because it's almost as if the Earth has been cut open for us. This is the perfect place to see a cross-section of time. The strata in the walls of the Grand Canyon show the Earth's layers, one stacked on top of the other. The more recent layers on top and the older material below. And the deeper we go into the canyon, the further we go back in time. But how long did it take for all of this to build up? When was the first strata formed? Let's ask an expert.
Secular scientists say with great confidence that the rocks in the Grand Canyon are in the inner gorge more than 1 billion years old, and these layered sediments between 270 and 540 million years old. They base these estimates on the decay of radioactive elements like uranium and their measurements of how fast uranium decays into lead and helium in the laboratory. These scientists assume that the rate they measure in the laboratory today has been constant since the Earth came into existence. However, about 10 years ago, some of my colleagues and myself found powerful evidence that the rate that uranium decays has not been constant in the Earth's past, but has been as much as 1 billion times higher than we measure it to be today. This has profound implications. It means that this assumption that the secular scientists have been using for the last 100 years is wrong. The implication for the rocks in the Grand Canyon is that these rocks are not hundreds of millions of years old, but only thousands of years old. But what about carbon-14, the method that most people are familiar with? Well, first of all, carbon-14 is used to date the remains of dead plants and animals and not rocks directly. Carbon is present in every living thing. Carbon has 3 isotopes. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are stable, but carbon-14 is radioactive. Carbon-14 decays into nitrogen-14 with a half-life of about 5,730 years, meaning half of it will disappear in that time. Plants take in atmospheric carbon. Animals eat the plants, and this introduces carbon-14 into their bodies. As long as the organism lives, it replenishes the amount of carbon-14 in its body, and the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 remains constant. After the plant or animal dies, the carbon-14 in its cells decays back to nitrogen without being replaced, while the carbon-12 and a tiny amount of carbon-13 remains. The amount of carbon-14 as compared to the total amount of carbon in an organism will yield a calculated time since the organism stopped absorbing carbon-14. This age estimate is the calculated time since the organism's death and thus the calculated approximate age of the specimen. But an astonishing discovery, this time made by the secular scientific community over the last 30 years, is that carbon-14 is routinely found at significant levels in fossils that are supposedly tens to hundreds of millions of years old. But compared to those timescales, C14 is like a flash in the pan. There should be no carbon-14 detectable in any living thing older than 100,000 years, or a tenth of a million years. What this implies is that all fossils are not millions of years old, but only thousands. And all the sediment-bearing layers of rock are only thousands of years old and not millions, including these we see in the Grand Canyon. And this implies that the Grand Canyon almost certainly has to be the product of the year-long Genesis flood, just a few thousand years ago.
The secular dates of these rocks depend on one thing: uniformitarianism. Has everything always happened at a uniform rate? Has sand always fallen at a constant speed, like the second hand of a clock, steadily tick, tick, ticking? Or has it sometimes gone very fast? If it hasn't been constant, well, that's a huge problem for the uniformitarian outlook. Scientists have found soft tissue as well as DNA in fossils. But we know both soft tissue and DNA degrade within hours after death, and certainly after years and centuries. So why do they still show up in fossils that are supposedly millions of years old? Don't worry, we'll get to the bottom of this. To find some answers, let's head deeper into the canyon, closer to the beginning. The prevailing theory is that the Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River over millions of years. But let's look at another hypothesis. What if all this didn't happen over millions of years? What if these strata were formed suddenly, catastrophically, like when a volcano blows?
The idea that sediment layers can form quickly was documented in a dramatic way in 1980 with the eruption of Mount St. Helens. The initial blast was a horizontally directed steam explosion with the power of 20 1-megaton bombs that flattened in seconds 230 square miles of lush conifer forest. Following that, there was 9 hours of eruption of mostly vertical ash driven by steam, that much of which fell down vertically back to the ground and resulted in a horizontal pyroclastic flow, hot volcanic ash flowing at roughly 100 miles an hour. This material formed orderly layers of material, just sediment layers, some just a fraction of an inch thick, and you had tens of feet, hundreds of feet thickness of this material, demonstrated very clearly how rapidly ordered layered sediments can form. Moreover, a single mud flow following the eruption resulted in the carving of a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon in one afternoon through this layered debris. So it also demonstrated that canyons can be cut very rapidly, within hours.
So maybe there are flaws in the ways that scientists calculate the age of things. If you go to practically any museum of natural history, they'll tell you that dinosaur fossils are tens of millions of years old. But how can they be sure?
The contradiction, though, is that you have these specimens, coal, wood, even dinosaur bones, that are supposed to be tens or even hundreds of millions of years old, and yet there's still detectable carbon-14 in them. And that just should not be the case. And we think this is illustrating that one of the key assumptions of the method is wrong, the assumption that the decay rates have been constant. Because if you assume that the decay rates have been constant throughout Earth history, you will get millions and billions of years for those dates. But that very assumption leads to a contradiction. If the decay rates have been constant throughout history, then those fossils really are millions of years old, and there should not be any carbon-14 in them, or at least none that we can detect. But there is. And so that's telling us, we think, that there's a problem with the method. Another indication that there's something wrong with the method involves these little crystals called zircons that we find in granite. And within the zircons, you have uranium-238, which is radioactive. And it goes through this multi-step process where that uranium-238 is transformed into lead, a particular isotope of lead. Now, if you look, for instance, at the amount of lead in the zircons, you can figure out how many years of decay that would be at today's rates. And it's about 1.5 billion years. So if you're looking at the lead in the zircons, you would conclude that it's about 1.5 billion years old. But there's another decay product that occurs in this process, and that's helium. When the uranium turns into lead, you have helium nuclei being produced, basically helium atoms minus the electrons. And so they eventually, along the way, they're going to pick up a couple of electrons, and they will become full-blown helium atoms. Well, these helium atoms, they don't react very well with other substances, and it's very easy for it to leak out of the zircons. If these zircons really are 1.5 billion years old, why is it that we still see large amounts of helium within the zircons? Because if they're really 1.5 billion years old, most of that helium should have leaked out. So here we have a contradiction within a single method. You have two decay products. You've got lead, you've got helium, and they're giving you two different ages for the zircon. And again, how do you resolve that paradox? Well, one way to resolve it would be if the decay rates have changed in the past.
Because of the types of rocks and fossils found in these layers, experts used to think that it took millions of years for these canyons to form. Now some have come to believe in a catastrophic theory of formation that says it all happened very quickly, violently, like from a global flood. Now I told you that we'd get to the bottom of these mysteries, and I think that we have. And the answers lie just below our feet and stretch out for hundreds of miles in every direction.
The lowest horizontal lying sediment layer in the Grand Canyon is known as the Tepete Sandstone. From the south rim, one can trace this layer from one horizon to the other. It occurs not just here at the Grand Canyon, but this Tepete Sandstone layer and its equivalents cover a large part of North America. The erosional boundary just below the Tepete Sandstone is commonly known as the Great Unconformity. It's an erosional discontinuity beveled off the rock beneath it before the Tepete Sandstone was laid down. Just above that boundary, in the lower part of the Tepete Sandstone, we find large boulders. There's one boulder 15 feet in diameter weighing 200 tons in the lower part of the Tepete Sandstone. It boggles the mind to imagine a water process, moving water, able to rip up boulders that large, roll them along, round off the edges, and deposit them in a big layer of boulders, and do it all over the North American continent. So this leads creation scientists like myself to conclude that this must mark the onset of the Genesis flood.
So the evidence suggests that the different strata might have been laid down in a much shorter period of time than we thought. If the rate of change in the Earth wasn't constant, and if these strata didn't form slowly over millions of years, then the assumptions we've been using for our age estimates aren't reliable. And that means that our planet is much younger than secular scientists say that it is. Let's see what the Bible has to say. In Exodus 20:11, we read, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day." That's an important point. Again, in Exodus 31:16-17, God says, "Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." But what is a day? Can't God define day however he wants? A day being a day, or a day being a million years? The Bible gives us some clues. In Genesis 1:4 and 5, God gives us his definition of day. God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. We can also work backwards to determine an approximate age of the earth by using the historical events described in Genesis, and learn how we became many people and how we formed many nations. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. As we'll see in future episodes, modern archaeology combined with history matches up with the biblical accounts. And we know from historical evidence where the nations were. So now our Bible is becoming our history book, our earth clock. We'll also explore this question of day from an astronomical perspective, and we'll see how distant starlight supports the theory of a young universe. Now, many of you are probably asking, why do I need to know this? Why does it matter whether Earth was created billions of years ago or only thousands? What difference does the time make? It matters because of this. If the Bible is wrong or misleading about time in its very first chapters, where else was it wrong? If God was just being metaphorical in the beginning, then how are we supposed to know when the Bible is being true or when it's just being literary? Are we just supposed to pick which parts of the Bible we want to believe? How do we know that creation happened the way the Bible said it did? If it's all just random chance, if life was just a happy accident, a fluke, then the biblical scriptures have no meaning. But just take a look around you. All of this was not created out of chaos. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. And now the beginning leads us to the end of this journey anyway. And we didn't have to go back billions of years either. The evidence we uncovered today suggests that the dating methods that most scientists have been using are flawed, and that the age of the Earth may be counted in thousands rather than millions of years. This matters because knowing that there's scientific evidence that backs up what we know in our hearts to be true strengthens our faith. And this matters because knowing how we got here helps us understand who we are, why we're here, and how we should live our lives. I'm Marcus Lloyd. Thanks for joining me in this episode, and our next show will take a closer look at dinosaurs because they raise big questions about faith. For a long time, scientists believed that these creatures roamed the planet tens of millions of years ago, but modern technology is leading us to question these findings. Why is it important that we get accurate information on the age of dinosaurs? We'll come back and we'll look closer into this and other mysteries contained in the book of Genesis. Almost everybody loves a good dinosaur movie. I know I do. Face it, dinosaurs are just cool. But where do these creatures fit into a Christian view of the world? Secular scientists tell us they went extinct 65 million years ago. But how does that fit with the story of Adam and Eve? Did the dinosaurs really live and die before man existed? Or could they have walked the earth at the same time as humans? Is the scientific evidence consistent with the Bible record? Or is one of them wrong? Hi, I'm Marcus Lloyd, and welcome to Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. Today, we are all about dinosaurs. Now, if you were like me as a kid, you love those things. I mean, even now, they're everywhere. In books, in movies, on TV, you can't get away from them. But why are we so fascinated with them? They weren't all so cool. Most dinosaurs were little, about the size of a modern dog. Only a few were massive, the big monsters we know and love, like the long-necked sauropods and Tyrannosaurus rex. We're told that the age of the dinosaurs, part of the Mesozoic era, began about 225 million years ago, supposedly long before man, and ended in mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, supposedly around 65 million years ago. We're also told that's when most of the great reptiles disappeared from the Earth, and very abruptly. But what happened to them? It remains a much debated mystery. We know that there was some cataclysmic event. Still, many scientists have no consensus on exactly what it was. The prevailing scientific theory is that an asteroid hit the Earth and changed the climate and food supply. Whatever the cause, this dinosaur disappearance marks a turning point in Earth's history. At the end of the Mesozoic era, the so-called age of the dinosaurs was over. And by geological standards, the end was abrupt and catastrophic. All but a few of the great reptiles disappeared. Some, like the crocodilians, are still with us. These animals are sometimes called living fossils because they are nearly identical to their fossils found in ancient rock layers. But for most of the dinosaurs, all that's left is this: fossilized remains. This is all we have of those incredible creatures, their bones. But look closely. This isn't what it seems. The original organic material it was formed of was replaced with minerals long ago. It's no longer a bone, but a rock. There's no soft tissue or collagen left in this one. It can't tell us much about the animal because we can't get biological information out of a rock. Or can we? Regardless, we can learn a lot from the fossil record. And these fossils will tell us even more if we look at them in the environment where they were found. So come on, let's take a little trip and find out firsthand what secrets they have to share. We're going to Dinosaur National Monument here in the American West. 10 different species of dinosaurs have been found in this park, along with the fossilized remains of plants and pollen and even insect tracks. The world was a very different place back then. Ferns, conifers, and ginkgo trees were growing here when the dinosaurs roamed the region. Some books tell us that 149 million years ago, the climate was warm, semi-arid, with year-round streams. But how do we know what the Earth was like when the dinosaurs walked the Earth? How do we know with any certainty what was going on here so long ago? I want to hear what science has to say about it.
Most evolutionists think that when the dinosaurs were on the Earth, it was during the Mesozoic. It was a time when the supercontinent Pangaea was breaking apart. And so the climate around the Earth was supposed to be very warm. But as Pangaea started to break up and new ocean currents started to move, the climate really started to change. And so the perspective is that the climate was warm, but there were a lot of climate changes as far as the amounts of precipitation and dryness radically changed throughout the Mesozoic. The age of the dinosaurs, from an evolutionary point of view, is divided into three main periods. That age of the dinosaurs is usually called the Mesozoic, which means middle life. It's divided into three time periods. The first called the Triassic, the second called the Jurassic, and the third called the Cretaceous. But the dinosaurs make their first appearance towards the end of the Triassic period. Most of the dinosaurs actually lived during the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous. The Triassic dinosaurs were quite small, and into the Jurassic, the size of the dinosaurs really increased. So even in the Jurassic time, we find the largest dinosaurs, which were the sauropod dinosaurs. Their weights were as great as 55 tons, and some of them were almost the length of half a football field. So they became very, very large during the Jurassic time period. It's in the Jurassic time period that we find the Stegosaur dinosaur show up, the long-necked, long-tailed sauropod dinosaurs, the Allosaur, which is kind of looks like the famous T-Rex. Into the Cretaceous time period, we find some other favorites. The Stegosaurs continued on. The duck-billed dinosaurs show up in the Cretaceous, as well as the Ceratopsians, which were the things like Triceratops, and the dinosaurs with the big bony frills behind their head show up in the Cretaceous.
There is a lot of information hidden in the Earth, and this place can tell us a great many things. But I bet we'd learn even more if the dinosaurs buried here could talk. Just think what secrets they could share. And maybe they can. Maybe they can tell us what we want to know. Can't hurt to ask. For the evolutionary scientists, dinosaurs are proof that the Earth is hundreds of millions of years old. They believe these great creatures evolved gradually throughout much of the long Mesozoic era, starting around 225 million years ago. This is the skeleton of an Allosaurus, estimated by some scientists to be 150 million years old. Paleontologists have painstakingly reconstructed it, putting the fossilized bones together like the pieces of a tremendous puzzle. So where does the Allosaurus fit in the big picture? What spot does it occupy on the evolutionary timeline? Well, that's an important part of the puzzle.
It's the identification of which dinosaurs are in which layers that help evolutionary scientists assign these layers to certain time ranges, all spoken of in terms of millions of years. So these dinosaurs are found in what we call Mesozoic strata, which include the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. When we see layers, the layers above it no longer have that particular kind. The assumption is that that kind went extinct. Sometimes we can infer an extinction event that occurred in there, and evolutionary stories tell that it was the extinction event that actually spurred, as somehow these creatures were struggling to survive in a new environment. So in the new environment, under evolutionary theory, they would have to evolve into a new form that would meet the challenges of the new post-extinction environment.
So according to evolutionary science, the world we know today came into existence during a long, gradual process. And they say our modern birds began to evolve from small dinosaurs way back in the Jurassic period. These evolutionary scientists think that insect-eating mammals began to appear at this time too, and they may have been nocturnal. They also claim that after the giant reptiles went extinct, these small mammals increased rapidly in size and diversity. There was an explosion of new types of animals, leading, finally, slowly, to us, to humans. Well, that's the theory anyway. But is it the whole story? To understand why we find the dinosaur fossils we do, we need to understand how fossils form in the first place. Not everything that dies becomes a fossil. Fossilization, in fact, is rare. Most dead plants or animals are eaten by scavengers or destroyed by bacteria. Those that become rapidly buried in sand or mud, like in a river flood or a landslide, have a better chance of becoming fossils. An animal's soft tissues, the skin and internal organs, usually rot away, even when it's buried, leaving only bones. Rapidly buried bones may become compressed in the sediment, and minerals from the surrounding earth slowly may seep into the bone, changing its chemical composition. Not even rock lasts forever. As the material around the fossil is removed by erosion, the fossil becomes exposed at the surface. If a paleontologist happens to spot it before it weathers away, the fossil can be excavated and preserved. So dinosaur fossils show that dinosaurs lived and died. According to evolutionary theory, this all happened long before mankind. But according to Genesis, God created the earth and man and all living creatures in the 6 days of creation. Creating wonderfully designed dinosaurs would have been no problem for an all-knowing, all-powerful God. So how does the Bible reconcile with the existence of dinosaurs? Were they created thousands of years ago? Or did they evolve over hundreds of millions of years? Secular scientists used to point to the dinosaurs' skeletal similarities as proof of evolution and evidence of a common ancestor. They believe that different skeletal structures evolved very gradually into the forms we know today. To understand the remarkable complexity of dinosaur anatomy, you just have to take a close look at the pelvic structure of this Allosaurus.
Modern reptiles and dinosaurs have similar pelvic constructions, with the exception that a lot of the dinosaurs had their legs directly underneath of them. And a lot of the modern reptiles that we have, for example, the alligators and crocodiles and things like that, they have their legs sprawled out to the side. And so the modern reptiles tend to crawl along, where a lot of the dinosaurs, like the sauropods and the T-Rex and things like that, had their legs directly underneath of them. The reason that that's important, a lot of the dinosaurs were so large, they needed the legs right underneath of them just to support their body weight.
And it turns out you can only reach a certain weight with the modern reptile lizard-like design, where the legs go out and then down, before it's too heavy to drag and to lift. So you need to have the pillars, so to speak, directly supporting the body weight. It shows design because it's all integrated. So when I see different parts, each one precisely shaped, specifically to fit with its neighbor in these joints, like parts of any machine, a camera, a computer, they're specifically fitted to one another, and they are obviously intended to work with one another, not against one another. All the bones of each dinosaur kind are just really well fashioned and fitted together. That's, to me, a hallmark of design.
So there's evidence to support the biblical creation of an entirely different type of reptile, the dinosaurs. The pelvic design just seems to appear without transitional forms in the rocks, just like it was created that way. Here's an easy way of looking at it. We'll call these the 5 C's. We've already talked about a few of them. First off, we've seen evidence that dinosaurs were created. Remember, the pelvic structure is more consistent with design than a slow evolution. There's definite evidence of divine creation in the way those bones fit together. Next up, catastrophe. Everyone agrees that the dinosaurs we find in the rock strata were killed off suddenly by some great cataclysmic event. And we find dinosaurs in layer upon layer of rocks deposited by water over every continent of the world. Secular scientists believe these layers containing the dinosaurs were caused by local floods and other small catastrophes with millions of years in between. But could it have been something else? Could it have been a year-long worldwide flood? Could the layers and layers of rock strata containing dinosaurs have been deposited one on top of another in rapid succession? Let's go back to the Southwest and take another look.
The Morrison Formation is really an exceptional formation. It's extraordinary. In the Dinosaur National Monument, there's dinosaurs that have been found there, including the sauropods, Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, and things like that. All these animals are found there, some of them mostly complete. Many would have us believe the dinosaurs were deposited in very lazy, slowly flowing rivers in the Morrison Formation, and at times these rivers went through periods of drought and dried up and so forth, and the animals died due to starvation or drought, and their carcasses kind of laid in the stream and decomposed and so forth. But we really don't see evidence of that when we look at the deposit.
You get channelized deposits, not broad continent, covering half of a continent type of deposit, but that's what you have, and it's volcanic. So the extent of the formation is one clue that this was catastrophic. The volcanic debris that's throughout this formation is a second clue that it was catastrophic in origin. And then the mixture of different creatures from different environments, including some that lived in watery environments, some that lived on land environments, and that's a catastrophe.
Based on the dinosaur graveyards, based on the fact that we see very different animals like dinosaurs and small snails and clams all mixed together, all those things tell us that this was a very catastrophic deposit.
The next two C's are carbon and collagen. We've discussed some of this in a previous episode. Carbon dating works when there is organic matter present and the samples are less than 100,000 years old. And you may remember this form of dating isn't always accurate because the decay rate of radioactive isotopes isn't constant. The next C is collagen. That's soft tissue. But remember, a fossil is a rock. There shouldn't be any organic material in it. And yet in 2004, Dr. Mary Schweitzer found soft tissue in a tyrannosaur thigh bone that had been thought to be about 70 million years old. This discovery raised serious questions about what scientists thought they knew about the age of fossils.
One of the things that's very clear to paleontologists is that organic material does not last a long time. Every type of organic material decomposes very quickly because there's bacteria that are present. And so if things are not rapidly buried and somehow sequestered from decay, they will disappear. And it doesn't matter if it's a hard bone or if it's soft tissue or even a hard shell. Over time, those things become broken or decompose. Collagen, surprisingly, has been found in a number of fossils now. We've been seeing what we think is collagen under the microscope for many years now. We're actually now being able to demonstrate that these are the original collagen molecules that we're finding. And I think that when we find molecules like this, like collagen, the possibility of DNA now, it's very suggestive that the Earth is not very old at all. It's very suggestive that the Earth is only thousands of years old.
The last C to remember the biblical evidence by is clashes. Could there have been contact between dinosaurs and humans? Let's go back for a minute to the very first questions we asked. Why are we so fascinated with dinosaurs? Why have we always been fascinated with them? We've been writing about them for as long as we've been writing. We find these fantastic creatures and cultures around the world. In China's sacred dragon, in the European tale of St. George, Native American lore tells of a monster in Lake Champlain. Historical figures like Marco Polo and Herodotus and Alexander the Great have described encounters with great serpents and other creatures that sound a lot like dinosaurs and other non-extinct giant reptiles. Why do we find these stories everywhere? Why are they so alike? Could it be because there really have been clashes with humans? Maybe people have actually encountered dinosaurs, and that's why these stories are so similar no matter where you go. Maybe some of these dragons are really dinosaurs. Let's find out what the Bible has to say about this. You may not know it, but you can find dinosaurs in the Bible. And check out this description of the behemoth from Job, where God says, "Look now at the behemoth, which I have made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit." That sounds like a dinosaur to me. And it fits with what the Bible says about death. It was man who brought death into the world when he disobeyed God. Death wasn't part of the world as it was originally created. Back then, life went on forever, and extinction was impossible. The Bible tells us in Romans 5:12, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. This happened because man rebelled against God. In 2 Peter 3:13, the Bible tells us God will one day make a new heaven and earth. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And what will that be like? Revelations 21:4 says, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. So does it matter whether dinosaurs lived at the same time as man? Historical science becomes a matter of faith, just like the Bible is a matter of faith. We can't go back in time to see what really happened. The same evidence, dinosaurs, fossils, soft tissue, and bone cells, analyzed and tested with the same scientific rigor, can yield different interpretations based on the worldview of the person interpreting the data. You can follow the scientific evidence and find that it conforms to the greatest book of knowledge that has ever been, the Bible. Only the Word of God gives us insight into the creation of dinosaurs, their burial in a worldwide flood, and their contact with humans after the flood. And only God was there as a witness to his creation. There's so much more to learn. In the next episode, we'll look at the Ice Age, another key event in Earth's history, how and when it happened, and what effect it had on the development of human civilization is something we'll explore next time on Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis.
Most of us have been taught that there was an ice age that profoundly influenced the Earth's climate, caused mass extinctions, and even altered the way civilization developed. But when it happened, and why it happened, remains a mystery. Was there an ice age? Were there many? Did they last thousands or even millions of years? And what caused them?
I'm Marcus Lloyd. Welcome to Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. Have you ever wondered what the Ice Age was like? When you hear the term Ice Age, you might think of snow as far as the eye can see. Now, evidence of at least one Ice Age is abundant. Where glaciers once were, you see boulders and rocks and dirt, which indicate the path of debris the glacier left behind as it moved. By these debris fields, or glacier moraines, scientists have determined that huge glaciers covered large areas of most continents. Most scientists agree that an ice age was the last major geologic event to happen on this planet. Some theories even suggest that the ice age contributed to the extinction of the dinosaurs. But differences of opinion exist on the number of ice ages there were, and when, and for how long. U.S. News and World Report even call the cause of the ice age one of the great mysteries of science. But why is there such a vast difference of opinion of whether there was one ice age, or many ice ages, or when they happened? The reason secular scientists hold to the idea that there were multiple ice ages over millions of years is that they have to in order to make their theories about everything else work. Whether it relates to geology, or fossils, or evolution, or the ice age, uniformitarian thinking requires an Earth calendar that goes back billions of years. Just one ice age doesn't fit their timeline for the age of the Earth. If they acknowledge that there was but one ice age not that long ago, all of their other theories based on long Earth ages would crumble too. Creation scientists, on the other hand, believe the evidence shows that the Ice Age can happen quickly and probably lasted only a few hundred years, which matches the biblical timeline, and confirms again that the Earth can be radically and quickly altered by a global catastrophe such as Noah's flood. Let's head to Alaska to explore some of the evidence for ourselves. Here we are on the Matanuska Glacier, a 27-mile-long river of ice in south-central Alaska. Secular scientists believe that glaciers like these formed hundreds of thousands and even millions of years ago. But we'll see that what we believe about how and when these glaciers formed, and when one or more ice ages occurred, largely depends on our point of view. Remember, secular scientists typically take a uniformitarian point of view that assumes geological processes went gradual and slow, unfolding over thousands or millions of years. Creation scientists, on the other hand, believe that geological processes can happen rapidly as the result of very high energy processes. We'll explore the evidence from both schools of thought as they apply to the mystery of the Ice Age. First, let's hear the secular perspective.
The secular theorists believe there have been at least 5 major ice ages throughout Earth history that have lasted, in some cases, tens of millions of years. The most recent of these supposedly began about 2.6 million years ago, and they think that within this most recent ice age, you had these smaller ice ages, these glacial cycles. So currently, they think there's been about 50 of these small ice ages, if you will, these glacial cycles within the last 2.6 million years.
To arrive at these theories about ice ages, scientists study glaciers, among other evidence. Glaciers are massive bodies of dense ice that are constantly moving under their own weight. As you'd imagine, they grow when the amount of snow in any given year exceeds the amount of melting, and shrink back, of course, when there's more melting than snow. To determine whether a glacier has undergone this cycle of expanding and retreating over time, some of the things scientists look at are the patterns of debris in glacial moraines.
When you look at the types of soil on the surfaces where there have been ice ages, there appear to be places where the ice moved and then stopped, melted back, left a certain type of soil, and then moved out again and back.
So, in addition to studying glacial debris, scientists also theorize about glacial periods by examining ice cores. In this method, scientists drill deep into the ice and take samples of ice from polar and low-latitude mountain glaciers to analyze the chemical composition of all the layers of ice. Indicators like the amount and type of oxygen isotopes, the concentration of methane, and the amount of dust gives clues about the climate during each cycle. The uniformitarian view is that each layer of ice cores represents 1 year. And by this measure, they've estimated that the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are millions of years old. But what even causes these cycles with long periods of ice formation and then long periods with a lack of snowfall and the ice melts? That's a question that scientists have been wrestling with for years. In fact, secular scientists offer over 60 ice age theories. There's clearly no consensus on what causes an ice age, but currently the astronomical theory is the most popular explanation.
Basically, the idea is that the Earth, as it's going around the sun, you have its rotational axis, and the orientation of that axis changes very slowly over time. And not only that, but the shape of the Earth's orbit changes slightly over time as well. And so that results in these very subtle changes in the amount of sunlight that's falling in the mid to high northern latitudes during the summer months.
During that period of time, there will be more ice accumulating, more snow. As it accumulates, as it spreads out and becomes more coverage over the continents, the surface of the ice reflects more radiation to space during the daytime, and at night it emits infrared radiation to space more effectively. Both of those cause cooling, which causes more ice to form, and so the ice age will accumulate, and then suddenly the orbital parameters will shift enough that suddenly there's more sun and it melts very quickly.
Based on physical evidence like glacial moraines, chemical analysis of layers of microorganisms that comprise seafloor sediments, and ice cores, uniformitarians believe that there have been multiple ice ages over long stretches of time. But there are some problems with these methods of measuring the age of ice. Secular scientists have acknowledged that the astronomical theory cannot by itself explain ice ages. You have to assume that some other unknown mechanisms can amplify these small changes enough to actually cause an ice age. But they have not, to date, figured out what this mechanism is. So there's more we need to understand before we can really settle on the astronomical theory as a likely explanation. There are also some issues with the way secular scientists measure ice cores. On the surface, it appears to make sense. Popular accounts give the impression that the dating of ice cores is quite simple. You just visually identify layers and count them. The reality is much more complicated.
In practice, it's a lot more difficult than simply counting these seasonal variations that you see in the ice cores, because those layers become indistinct as you go deeper into the ice. So they have to use something called this flow model that tells you how the ice thins with increasing depth. And those flow models have assumptions built into them. And basically, those assumptions assume that the ice sheets have been in existence for millions of years and that they've had more or less the same height for all that time. And so those models predict that you're going to get this enormous amount of thinning as you go deeper in the ice. And so naturally, you're just going to end up from that model with a very large number of annual layers.
One might make the assumption that colder winters are the catalyst for an ice age. But there's one big problem with that notion. Extremely cold temperatures generally result in less, not more, snowfall. Cold air has less moisture. Less moisture means less snow. Look at some of the very cold places on the Earth today. Even here in Alaska, the summers are too warm for a glacier to form. Warm summers would be a problem for any ice age, since they would melt any ice sheets or glaciers that were starting to form. Numerous theories focus on the decrease of temperature due to secular assumptions of uniformitarianism. In reality, a combination of several things have to happen to create an ice age. Let's head back to the cozy, warm lab to discuss this. To create an ice age, first we need heat. Let's say that tectonic friction and underwater volcanoes raise the temperature of the oceans by 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. Then, as the oceans warm, more water evaporates. More moisture in the air means more precipitation, including more snowfall at mid and high latitudes. Then, eruptions from volcanoes on the land eject aerosols into the stratosphere. These tiny solid particles in liquid droplets block and reflect the sun's rays back into space. Moisture from evaporation gets trapped in, while energy from the sun gets trapped out. The result? Cooler summers when the winter snow doesn't melt, followed by winters when more snow falls. As the snow packs down, the pockets of air in between the ice crystals get squeezed out, and what's left is ice. As this cycle continues, the ice sheets continue to grow, and then you have an ice age. You can remember this cycle by the acronym HEAT. H for hot oceans,
E for evaporation, A for aerosols, and T for time. So to make an ice age, we need hot oceans, evaporation, aerosols, and time. Less time than you'd think. But what could cause the oceans to heat up that much and throw aerosols into the atmosphere high enough to block the sun's rays? Creation scientists attribute it to a catastrophe of global proportions, Noah's flood. Could Noah's flood have created the right conditions for an ice age to follow? By looking at one example from the recent past, we can see how just one big volcanic eruption can throw enough aerosols into the air to block the sun's rays and lower the surface temperature of the Earth for an extended period. Here's what happened. In June of 1991, on Luzon Island in the Philippines, the dormant stratovolcano Mount Pinatubo suddenly erupted. The eruption sent approximately 10 billion tons of volcanic ash and debris miles into the sky. The eruption was several times larger than the one at Mount St. Helens. Fragmented materials from the explosion were so vast they covered the South China Sea and plunged the island of Luzon into total darkness. Aerosols reached high into the stratosphere. The increased amounts of ash and sulfuric acid from the eruption caused a roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit decrease in temperature around the world for about 2 years. In August of 1991, the space shuttle captured dramatic pictures of 2 stratospheric aerosol layers from the Mount Pinatubo eruption. Many scientists who believe in the Bible explain the Ice Age as the result of catastrophic events such as what happened in the Philippines. When I say catastrophic, I mean, and try to get your head around the sight of volcanoes and other explosions with the power of nuclear bombs detonating all over the world at the same time. And imagine that massive energy. Energy like the planet hadn't experienced since creation. Now picture hundreds of Mount Pinatubos erupting at the same time. Whew, and talk about energy. Creation scientists believe that during Noah's flood, powerful energy was generated not only from massive storms, but by volcanism, earthquakes, and massive shifting of the planet's tectonic plates. Evidence of volcanic and tectonic potential this destructive can be found literally around the planet.
The heating of the ocean, we believe, came from magma coming from the mantle up through the plates in the ocean. That would have caused tremendous heating to the ocean, as much as a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That would have produced tremendous evaporation, energizing of storms, hurricanes, and producing snow and ice in the polar regions and on mountaintops.
Another example from recent history shows that it doesn't take millions of years to form a thick glacier. Crater Glacier on Mount St. Helens is already over 300 feet thick, despite the fact that it has only been forming since the 1980 eruption. Today, secular and creation scientists agree that warming oceans contribute to changing weather patterns. All you have to do is turn on the TV to see evidence that storms are more severe in some areas, while other areas are experiencing record-setting heat and drought. Could the destruction of Noah's flood been catastrophic enough to cause a worldwide change in climate? Enough to cause one ice age? Creation scientists think it's entirely plausible, and they are using sophisticated computer modeling to prove it.
When the heat came up from the plates in the oceans, it caused the oceans to become very warm, and it would be like a giant El Nino effect. Well, can you imagine if the oceans were 20, 30, 40 degrees warmer than they are today? We would expect all kinds of severe weather, gigantic hurricanes, which I call hypercanes, and this would produce all kinds of evaporation into the atmosphere, which could then come out as snow in the polar regions and on mountaintops. I've modeled that with conventional models with a sea surface temperature hotter than we would normally experience today. When that happens, these models predict much, much greater precipitation rates, particularly in the polar regions and on mountaintops. And we can explain the Ice Age in less than 500 years simply by the warmth of the ocean.
So if you take a look at destruction caused by recent tsunamis, mudslides, volcanoes, and earthquakes, it's not hard to imagine the destruction that Noah's flood caused. Imagine that everywhere you step was at one time underwater. When Noah and his family were finally able to step on land again, the Earth's surface was probably more like a giant mudslide. Then you add an enormous amount of aerosol particles from explosive volcanic eruptions, preventing solar radiation from warming the Earth. There would have been a massive cooling effect that would have been most pronounced during the summer and autumn months. This would have prevented the snow from melting, resulting in more and more snow. The result was the Ice Age. Man, how people must have struggled to survive during that time. It's almost unimaginable. But humans and civilization did survive the worldwide catastrophe, thanks to Noah and his obedience. And from that small group of people, civilization was rebuilt. So how did humans survive? In the creation model, there were not multiple brutal ice ages that lasted thousands of years, as secular models theorize. It was just one. And while it probably was not a whole lot of fun for the people living in it, it wasn't as bad as you think.
The Ice Age would not have been equally severe everywhere. Even at their greatest extent, they probably would have only covered maybe 30% of the Earth's land surface. And at lower latitudes, you would have had some areas that would have been very lush. So it's not going to be equally severe everywhere. There's going to be some places where it's quite temperate, and it's not such a bad thing. Some people may have lived, for instance, at the edges of those ice sheets in Europe and places like that. And so it might have been a little bit harsh in some cases, but for the creation model of the Ice Age is a lot more tolerable than the uniformitarian model.
So when we hear that glaciers are melting, and when we see increasingly violent storms creating massive destruction, should we be worried? All I can say is that you can take comfort in what God said in the 8th chapter of Genesis. I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. God placed a sign in the sky after the flood as a promise that he would not destroy the earth again by flood. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And why is that important? It's another example of how God fulfills his covenant. Remember what God promised to Noah. Genesis 9:1 tells us, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Even secular scientists agree that the glaciation during the Ice Age caused the sea levels to drop, revealing bridges of land between continents. They also agree that as these ice sheets expanded, they forced humans and animals to migrate to warmer latitudes in order to survive. Could this have just been coincidence? I like to think it was just God's way of helping mankind fulfill his command. Now, we've seen some pretty convincing evidence that the effects of Noah's flood could have caused the Ice Age. And as technology advances, we are learning more and more about how science confirms the truths of Scripture. The world can be a cold place when you go at it alone. But with God, there's always a shelter from the storm. After the Lord destroyed the earth by a catastrophic flood, because Noah was faithful to God's word, the Lord gave humanity a second chance on earth. By letting Noah and his family live to repopulate the earth, God's gift of grace was given to mankind. It's because of his grace that you and I are here today. Join me next time as we take a fascinating look at how ancient civilization began again after Noah's flood. We'll ask a lot more questions, and we'll find the answers together as we continue to unlock the mysteries of Genesis.